god, it is me, Cringe Captain 615, reported to for duty, and don't mind my speed. So, in today's reaction video, I am going to react to Mr. Nightmare Scares. And before we get started, here's his channel for proof. And I'm gonna subscribe to him so I can actually see some notifications on his videos if I don't miss anything. That does not make sense, but this one is 44 minutes and 37 seconds. I'm not gonna watch the whole thing, but let's see how far we get up to. If you want to see this video, I'll link it down in the description or the comment down below so you can watch it. Because I'm not showing the whole thing. I'll just show part of it or half. So maybe like 8 true scary horror stories. So maybe I'll show 3 or 4. I'll show 3 or 4, and you guys can see the rest on your own. How about that? That sounds wonderful. Yeah. So, let's get started. And yeah, this is my first time I am going to test out something. I'm going to combine 2 videos, which is the audio on my phone, and then the computer will just show me on there and show the screen of what I'm about to react to, and then I'll film on the iPad. See my iPad? I can't tell where the camera is, so I think you can see it. So I'll record from the iPad, and hopefully it collects something good from it, so I can upload it from the iPad to YouTube. That's what I'm gonna try, and see how it turns out afterwards, and hear all of your opinions. Let me know down in the comments down below if you liked it, and I should do it again. For now, this is just an experiment. One-time thing until someone say, oh, I like it, you should do it more often, and then I'll gladly do it. Like, I could definitely do this. As long as you give me the motivation to do it. And if I give myself motivation at the credits. Okay, maybe not the credits, but motivation, yes. And if you don't like it, then I'm gonna say it right now. No more reaction videos. I'm sorry. And we're gonna react to this because it's almost Halloween. A little spooky. That did not sound correct. Alright, let's start. Jesus ass. Jesus ass got me a little bit.
Growing up in a small town, you tend to notice things. People in my village kept to themselves, but everyone still knew each other's business. Our street was quiet, lined with old houses and tall trees that whispered in the wind. My family lived in a small house with a white picket fence, but our neighbor's house was different. Bigger, newer, and always spotless, it looked out of place. The owner of that house, Mr. Collins, was a wealthy man who lived there with his wife, Mrs. Collins, and their 2-year-old daughter, Stacy. Mr. Collins was an odd man. He didn't speak much and kept to himself. But what stood out the most was his obsession with his car. He owned a sleek black sports car, the kind you only see in magazines. Every weekend, without fail, he would be outside, polishing and cleaning it as if it were made of gold. He would spend hours on that car, making sure every inch was perfect. Sometimes, I would watch him from my window, wondering why a car could mean so much to someone. Mrs. Collins was the complete opposite of her husband. She was always kind and friendly, often waving at me when she passed by. Sometimes, she would even stop to chat, asking about school or offering me some of the cookies she baked. Stacy was a happy little girl, always giggling and playing in their yard. The sight of them together was comforting, a rare bit of warmth in our otherwise quiet neighborhood. But then one day, everything changed. Mrs. Collins and Stacy disappeared. It was like they vanished into thin air. I remember the day the police came to our door, asking if we had seen Mrs. Collins or Stacy. They said Mr. Collins reported them missing, claiming his wife had left him and taken their daughter with her. My parents were shocked, but there wasn't much we could tell the police. We hadn't seen anything unusual, and like everyone else, we just assumed Mrs. Collins had left on her own. Weeks passed, then months, and there was no sign of them. The whole town buzzed with rumors, each one wilder than the last. Some said Mrs. Collins ran away with another man, while others whispered about something far darker. I tried to push it out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I saw Mr. Collins polishing his car, a chill ran down my spine. It felt wrong, like he was trying to distract himself from something horrible. One day, a few months after Mrs. Collins and Stacy had disappeared, something strange happened. My dad was in the garage, fixing up his old truck, when he noticed something odd in Mr. Collins's garage. The door was slightly open, and inside, barely visible, was Mrs. Collins's white Jeep. It was covered in dust like it hadn't been touched in months. My dad called my mom and me over to see, and we all stood there, staring at it in shock. If Mrs. Collins had run away, why would her car still be here? A few days later, we noticed the Jeep was gone. Mr. Collins had sold it, or at least that's what we guessed. He didn't say anything to us, but the way he started acting was even stranger. He stopped going outside as much, and when he did, he seemed nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder like he was being watched. The once spotless car now had a layer of dirt on it, and his yard, which used to be immaculate, was beginning to look neglected. Then one night, something happened that I'll never forget. My parents and I were having dinner when we heard a loud crash from Mr. Collins's house. My dad grabbed a flashlight and told us to stay inside as he went to check it out. From the window, I watched him walk across the yard and knock on Mr. Collins's door. It took a long time for Mr. Collins to answer, and when he did, he looked pale, almost sick. My dad asked if everything was okay, but Mr. Collins just nodded and said he had dropped something. My dad came back inside, but he looked unsettled. He told us he had seen something strange when Mr. Collins opened the door. In the dim light of the hallway, he saw a pot of some kind of liquid on the stove and, next to it, a gun on the kitchen counter. He couldn't explain it, but something about the scene had disturbed him deeply. After that night, things seemed to spiral out of control. Mr. Collins became even more reclusive, and the whispers around town grew louder. Some people believed he had done something terrible to his wife and daughter, but there was no evidence, no proof, just suspicion and fear. I started having nightmares about it, about what could have happened behind those closed doors. The thought that something terrible might have taken place so close to home was terrifying. Years have passed since then, and I've grown up, moved away, and tried to leave those memories behind. But now and then I think about Mrs. Collins and Stacy. I wonder what happened to them, where they are now, and if they ever found safety. I'll never forget the sight of that white Jeep in the garage, the look on Mr. Collins' face when my dad knocked on his door, or the fear that gripped our town in the months that followed. Sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I still feel that chill running down my spine. I'll never know for sure, but I fear the worst. And I hope, wherever they are, that Mrs. Collins and Stacy are safe, far away from the man who spent so much time polishing his car. I had been delivering food for a few months now, driving around the city and getting to know every corner of it. Most nights were routine. Pick up the order, follow the GPS, drop it off, and move on to the next one. But this night was different. It was late, maybe past midnight, and I had just received an order from a part of town I didn't recognize. The GPS led me away from the familiar roads and into a neighborhood I had never seen before. The houses were spaced far apart, and the streets seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. Each corner I turned seemed to take me deeper into the maze of narrow roads and dark alleys. The streetlights were few and far between, casting long, eerie shadows that made the entire area feel off. The further I drove, the more I felt like something was wrong. The roads didn't seem to match up with the map on my phone. I would make a turn, and suddenly, the GPS would tell me to turn back, as if the streets were changing while I drove. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach, but I knew I had to deliver the order. That was the job. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the GPS announced that I had arrived. I slowed the car and looked at the house. It stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, a tall, narrow building with peeling paint and broken windows. The lawn was overgrown, the grass reaching up to my knees, and there was no sign of life. It looked abandoned. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the gear shift, ready to put the car in reverse and get out of there. But then I thought about the order, about the customer waiting for their food. Maybe it was just an old house and someone still lived there. Maybe they were just too busy or too tired to fix it up. I tried to shake off the unease that clung to me like a cold fog. I got out of the car, taking the bag of food with me. The air was thick and heavy, almost suffocating. As I walked toward the house, the gravel crunched under my feet, the only sound in the silent night. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. My skin prickled with the sensation of a chill running down my spine. When I reached the porch, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. It creaked open with the slightest push, revealing a dark hallway that stretched into the unknown. I could barely see a few feet inside, the darkness swallowing everything beyond that. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, just the echo of my voice bouncing back at me from the empty hall. Something deep inside me screamed to leave, to drop the food and run back to the car. But I took another step forward, peering into the darkness. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like leaves being dragged across the ground. I turned to look back at the street, and that's when I saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, stepping out from between the houses and around the corners. They moved silently, almost like they were gliding across the ground. My heart started pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as they got closer. The first one stepped into the dim light of the porch, and I could see it. It was a person, but their face was hidden behind a blank, white mask. The mask had no features, just smooth, cold porcelain. The others followed, all wearing the same eerie, expressionless masks. They surrounded me, their presence pressing in on me from all sides.
It was a trap. I knew it. It was a trap. I knew it was a trap. I knew it.
Sides. I tried to back away, but I was trapped against the porch railing. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, my mind racing for a way out. One of them reached out, and I flinched, dropping the bag of food to the ground. Their hands were cold as ice as they grabbed me, pulling me toward the house. I struggled, trying to break free, but they were too strong. The more I fought, the tighter their grip became. They didn't say a word, didn't make a sound as they dragged me inside. The door slammed shut behind us, plunging me into darkness. I was blind, my other senses taking over. I could hear their footsteps around me, soft but purposeful. I could feel their cold hands on me, searching through my pockets, taking my wallet, my phone, and my keys. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the sound died in my throat. It was as if the darkness had swallowed my voice. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. All I could feel was the overwhelming dread, the terror that gripped me as they continued to strip me of everything I had. Finally, they let go of me, and I collapsed to the floor, trembling. I could hear their footsteps fading away, the creak of the door opening and closing again. They were gone, leaving me alone in the pitch-black house. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too scared to move. My mind replayed the events over and over, trying to understand, but there was no understanding. It was like I had stepped into another world, a place where the rules didn't apply, where nothing made sense. Eventually, I forced myself to stand up, my legs shaking beneath me. I found the door, pushed it open, and stumbled out into the night. The street was empty, no sign of the masked figures, no sign of anyone. My car was still there, untouched as if nothing had happened. I had been robbed, not just of my belongings, but of something more, my sense of safety, my trust in the world around me. I drove away from that house as fast as I could, the streets still twisting and turning, leading me in circles until I finally found my way out. When I reached the main road, I didn't look back. I just kept driving, trying to escape the memory of those blank masks, of the cold hands that had pulled me into the darkness. But I knew, no matter how far I drove, I would never truly escape. The fear would always be there, lurking just out of sight, waiting to drag me back into that twisting, endless nightmare. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family.
Welcome.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
The hospital was quiet at night, almost too quiet. I was an orderly, and my shift always seemed to drag on forever. The endless white walls, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, and the distant beeps from machines made the place feel eerie when the sun went down. The only real escape was the basement office, a small, dimly lit room where I spent most of my nights when things were slow. The office was right next to the morgue, a place I tried not to think about too much. It was around midnight, maybe a little after, and I was sitting in the office with another orderly. We weren't doing much, just passing the time with idle conversation and the occasional glance at the clock, waiting for our shifts to end. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant, the kind that clings to your clothes and fills your lungs. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the overhead light and the distant rumble of the air conditioning. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, not like the rushed steps of a doctor or nurse. The sound caught both of our attention.